everybody, to BookEnds Online Edition, produced by the Wadena County Historical Society and Travel and Storyseller in collaboration with New York Mills Regional Cultural Center. BookEnds is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Five Wings Arts Council, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. BookEnds programs from previous authors are now available on the website of the Wadena County Historical Society at www.wadenacountyhistory.org. Today's program will also be available on the website shortly. This month's speaker is Naomi Kritzer. Naomi Kritzer's newest book, Chaos on CatNet, is a YA novel featuring a group of teenagers who have found friendship and community online, never realizing that one of their online friends is actually an artificial intelligence. Naomi is a science fiction and fantasy writer living in St. Paul, Minnesota. She has been writing science fiction and fantasy for 20 years. Her book, Catfishing on CatNet, has won the Minnesota Book Award, the Edgar Award, and the Lodestar Not a Hugo Award. Next month's BookEnds will be Saturday, August 14th. If you have questions for today's author, feel free to enter them through chat. If you'd like to order books, you may do so through our bookseller, Travel and Storyseller, at gmail.com. Now, let's welcome BookEnds Online Edition, Naomi Kritzer. Welcome, Naomi. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. So do I just launch into it?
If you'd like. Okay. Yeah.
All right. So yeah, as you heard, I'm Naomi Kritzer. I live in St. Paul. I have 8 published books, or 10 if you count my 2 self-published short story collections. I originally grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, and moved to Minnesota for college and stayed after I graduated in 1995. I have 2 kids, one of whom is a teen and one of whom is a young adult. And I've always had at least 1 cat since my husband and I got married. Basically, the first thing we did after getting home from our honeymoon was to go get a cat. So I currently have 3. Yeah, so I started writing when I was very young. I have stuff back to my 4th grade. My 4th grade creative project was an attempt at a novel involving a talking horse. And I started submitting stories as a teen and got as far as like nice rejection letters occasionally. And I graduated college in 1995 and got fairly serious about writing in 1997, which meant I joined a critique group and started writing regularly. I sold my first short story in 1999, and I actually sold my first novel in 2001. So my first novel was based off a short story that I had written that got a lot of rejections saying this reads like the first chapter of a novel. There were a couple of keys to the process of writing it. The first was writing every day. At the time I had a day job but no children, so I wrote in the evenings and was almost superstitious about every day. Like if I was sick and really didn't feel like writing, I would like make myself sit down at my keyboard and write like a sentence. And as long as I wrote one word, even one word, helped the words come more easily the next day. So second, the way I plotted it out was to think about the really big scenes throughout the book and to treat those as intermediate destinations. So rather than trying to plot out the whole book, I had sort of like a general shape of the arc with like a couple of big, the big scenes where like, everything blows up. And then I would brainstorm the stuff for each section. As I would write each section, I would brainstorm things that could happen and then sort of put them in some sort of order and then write that section. I got a lot better at, this was my very first novel. I got better at writing as I went. And so the first section in particular got revised really heavily. There was one point where after I'd like written the whole thing, I went back and I was like, oh man, this first section is so rough. Like I wasn't pacing it like a novel because I hadn't written one before. And so I went back and I basically just started the first section over from scratch, knowing that as long as at the very end, the same 2 characters like headed out, I could just sort of slot it in like a Lego brick and it would be fine. one of the rewrites I did was after I got some feedback that, especially in that first section, the stakes didn't feel high enough. So I went through and I looked and I found I found a character that like didn't have anything else to do for the rest of the book, and I had her killed on the page. That definitely raised the stakes. Every time I rewrote it, it got longer, and that was a problem because what they tell you is that like a novel should be around 100,000, like 80,000 words is sort of the short end for an adult novel. 80,000 words is the short end, like 110,000 is sort of the long end. Unless you're George R.R. Martin. If you're George R.R. Martin, you can write whatever length you want. People will be happy to buy it. But like, as a first-time novelist, you know, you don't have that. There are a lot of things that George R.R. Martin can get away with that you can't get away with as a first-time novelist. So I tried, I was trying to cut it down, and instead, every time I rewrote it, it got longer. So I found an agent who had me rewrite it once again, and then that agent sold it to Bantam, and Bantam decided to split it into 2 books and have me expand them, which was great because now I had like the space and the luxury to like make it as long as it felt like it needed to be. And then I sold Bantam a trilogy, this time on proposal, which meant I wrote sort of an explanation of what I was going to write for them, and they paid me in advance, and then I wrote it. One major change to my life between writing the duology, my first novel, which turned into 2, and writing the trilogy, was that I had become a mom. So when I got the contract for the first book of the trilogy, and had to start writing the first book, my firstborn was 2 years old, and I had just found out I was pregnant. So I remembered that the last month of my pregnancy, the first time around, I hadn't wanted to do anything at all. So I arranged for the book's due date to be about a month before my baby's due date. And what that meant was I turned in the book on time, and 2 weeks later, on an incredibly hot September day, where I had taken my older kid to buy some sweet corn from the farmer's market, and then our car had broken down, and I had to walk home with my 2-year-old and all the corn in a little umbrella stroller. And I'd handed my spouse the sweet corn and said, "You do dinner, I'm tired," and gone upstairs to sit down at my computer. My water broke, and I had a letter from my editor saying, "Here are the revisions. Can you have these back to me in 2 weeks?" And I said, "No, absolutely not, absolutely not." But the good news is that now I know when I'm having the baby, because I mean, of course, you never know exactly when a baby's going to arrive, which is, a little bit complicated with publishing schedules. I don't remember how long it took me to get those revisions back, but it was at least a month. It might have been 6 weeks. And then I had to write book 2 with an infant and a 3-year-old. So the way I wrote that book was my 3-year-old had just started preschool and had preschool like 2 or 3 days a week. So I would drop the older one at preschool and then come home, and I would try to get the baby to nap. And if I could get her to nap, I would drop everything else and do nothing but write for as long as she slept. And also on Saturdays, my husband would take both the kids out of the house for several hours every Saturday, and usually also on Sundays. So I had like a couple of really long stretches over the weekends and like whatever time I could grab during the week. So I got that book done and in on time. And then book 3, I now had a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old. And the problem I ran into was that Kira, my younger child, got resistant to napping, but she would still nap in the car. So I would take my older kid to preschool, and then I would buckle the baby toddler into her car seat, and I would put my laptop in the passenger seat. I would drive until she fell asleep, and then I would pull over and park the car somewhere and get out my laptop and like lean it against the steering wheel and type until I heard her stirring. And then I would close the laptop and put it on the passenger seat and drive a couple more miles. And that's how I wrote the novel. Although I still had to bring my laptop on a rustic vacation because it was like, I'd hoped to get it done before we went on the trip, and I didn't. So went on this rustic vacation where I wound up having to go to the campground laundromat and run an extension cord to my laptop and sit on the steps of this little like campground laundry and write that way. And the ergonomics of all this were so horrifying. And like, I like look back at that, I was in my early 30s, and at least this was possible for me physically and not great, but now I'd be like, there's no way, I cannot. I'm a delicate flower old lady who needs like back support and wrist support and all of that. So, um, so after all that, the trilogy sold poorly. And the third book came out in 2006, and the economy was kind of in the process of tanking, although it didn't get really serious about it until 2007, at which point it got incredibly bleak, and the publishing houses all cut everyone loose they could, like everyone, including me. So Bandham did not want my next book. I also around this time fired my agent. This was because this was by now my second agent. My first agent had quit agenting, and his partner had inherited me as a client. And so, and I was not happy with him. So I fired him and signed somewhat ill-advisedly with a new agent who was really, 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 really nice and loved my books. And as far as I know, never sold a single book to anyone. So I wrote an urban fantasy novel about a young woman in Minneapolis having the Ark of the Covenant dropped on her doorstep by FedEx. And I wrote a middle grade science fiction novel about 3 kids who got stranded alone on an alien planet. And I wrote a middle grade fantasy novel where there's a portal to another world in South Minneapolis, and none of these sold. So I fired my nice agent, and then I couldn't find anyone to represent me at all. This was all incredibly discouraging. Writing careers are often portrayed as linear. You're an unknown, and then you break in, and then you've broken in, so you can sell stuff, right? And it turned out I was going to have to break in a second time. What I did still have was my writers group, which included my best friend, Lyda. Lyda Morehouse, who also writes as Tate Holloway, found out that I was still writing short fiction, but that I'd gotten so discouraged that I wasn't sending it out. So she said she would be my short fiction agent and submit it for me, which really basically, you don't need an agent to submit short fiction. You just need to, at the time, you needed to be willing to go to the post office, and that was where I was getting hung up. I just didn't want to go to the post office. And she was like, I go to the post office all the time. I will mail these for you, don't worry. And that was how I broke back in, because I could still sell short fiction. And as time passed, I felt some regained confidence. It also helped that more and more markets stopped making you mail them stuff and started letting you email them stuff, which I'm much better at email than I am at the post office. So I started sending out my own short stories, and they would sell. And also querying agents again, and that didn't work. So still didn't have an agent for a long time. In 2015, I wrote a short story about an AI who loves cat pictures and wants to help people. And I sold this short story to Clarkesworld, which is an online magazine. Later that same year, I wrote a short story about a pandemic, and I sold that one to Clarkesworld too. In 2016, Cat Pictures Please won the Locus Award and the Hugo Award, and it was nominated for the Nebula, and it got a tremendous amount of attention. For complicated reasons, it probably got more attention than Hugo winning short stories normally would. And that gave me enough of a boost that I was able to get an agent again. So we're on agent 4 now. Martha, the new agent, started shopping around the novel I had that had not previously made the rounds. This novel that she was shopping for me is what's called a fix-up. It's a novel that's a bunch of linked short stories. She also sold a short story collection to a small press for me. So the fix-up novel was called Liberty's Daughter. And these were short stories that had all been published in a magazine. And I don't know if it really was YA, but it starred a teenager. And these days, if you have a book with a teenage main character, it'll probably be published as YA, at least if they're a teenager the whole time. So she submitted it. She sent that around, and editor Susan Chang at Tortine got back to Martha and said they couldn't publish the novel because the short stories had appeared previously, but had I considered writing a YA novel based on Cat Pictures Please, the short story? So Martha called to ask, and I said, well, I hadn't, but you know what? I could totally consider writing a novel based on the short story. So Martha had me write a proposal and some sample chapters, and within a couple of months, I had a contract to write a YA novel involving the friendly cat-loving AI. So this was going to be a very different process. but not an uncommon one. It's really not unusual for writers to wind up writing this way, like where an editor says, you know what I really need right now is mermaid outlaws. Mermaid outlaws are super hot. And the writer says, oh, I've always had a mermaid outlaw book in me. This is how Lido wound up writing vampire romance as Tate Halloway. And I have another friend who was told, hey, like there's some fantasy authors who are writing like this really cool, dark, semi-epic fantasy, and like, but they don't turn books in very often, so we want like that, but every year. And so he wrote a whole series that was sort of similar in flavor to successful but not prolific author, only, you know, everything came out much more quickly. But I needed a teenage character because this was YA, and they needed to be friends with the AI. And this was somebody who needed to basically live online. And it needed to be for an interesting reason, because a lot of teenagers live online, but more typically it's shyness or a gaming addiction, or, well, recently it's because of the pandemic, but like weirdly, that wasn't a plot twist I even considered. But I wanted a reason that could drive a lot of the rest of the plot. And I also knew that partway through the AI was going to get in trouble with its creator and need to be rescued. So my teenage protagonist is Steph. And I decided that she lived online because she was extremely mobile. Her mother moves every few months, pulling her out of school and taking her away from any real life friends she's made because they're on the run from her father. And in the original version of the novel, Steph is really interested in bats and gets involved in a bat research project near her latest house and then doesn't want to leave. That plotline never really fit, and it got written out completely. I mean, she still likes bats, but the bat research stuff just got completely excised when Susan sent the book back to me for revisions. One of the biggest and best changes made in the editorial stage when Susan sent the book back for rewrites was that she said she really liked Steph, and she really liked Rachel, who's this girl who befriends Steph at the new school that she starts at the beginning of the book. And I needed to find something more interesting for them to do together than shop for kitty litter, which was spot on. She also noted that robots become really important later in the book. And so I needed to do more with robots in the first part of the book, so that there's sort of like the robots are throughout instead of, oh, look, robots, like midway through, suddenly they show up. So I put together a subplot where this rural school uses an instructional robot to teach their sex ed class because you can control exactly what a robot says to students. And then Steph and Rachel work with Steph's online friends and the AI to hack the robot. And then the AI teaches the sex ed class. And this was basically a missing big turning point scene. Like, this is what I like, you know, when I talk about, I still kind of write that way, where I like think about the big explosive scenes and then sort of think about how to write from one to the next. This is one of those scenes now, and that first section of the book was missing it. And so once it was added, it was much stronger. I wound up needing a bit of extra time to write this because 2017 was an incredibly distracting year, and 2018 was not much better. But I got it done, both the writing and the revisions, and the book came out in November of 2019. And it was really well received. It won the Minnesota Book Award, the Edgar Award, and the Lodestar Award, Edgar for Mysteries, Lodestar for Science Fiction. It was also nominated for the Locus Award, which is science fiction, the ITW Thriller Award, which is thrillers, and the Anthony, which is mysteries. I had not realized I was writing a mystery when I wrote this, or a thriller, but apparently, and people who like those sorts of books really enjoyed it. So the sequel, Chaos on CatNet, I wrote in 2018 and 2019. When Martha, my agent, sold the books, I had a 2-book contract where the second book was just to be determined. So then in May of 2018, I talked to my editor and pitched the idea of another book about these characters. And this time the book would be kind of about online radicalization, which was something I've been thinking about a lot. Once I actually plunged into writing it, the problem I hit is that a lot of the online radicalization that is happening in the real world involves like actual white supremacists and fascists recruiting people. And that was the last thing I wanted to write about, because I wanted my books to be fun, and Nazis are not fun at all. So I made up an extremist group that was kind of less ideological and more like, maybe if we destroy everything, we can build a utopia and whatever's left. And I worked from there. I turned it in July of 2019. And Susan got me editorial feedback in February of 2020. And I thought I could probably get this done pretty soon. But sometimes I have an initial cranky response when I get an editorial letter. So I read it, then I set it aside, and then I come back to it and I read it again. And you probably guess what happened. I set it aside, and right around the time I should have been getting back to it, the pandemic showed up and ate my brain completely. Like I spent all my time thinking about it, worrying about it, tweeting about it, writing to friends about it. Like, I mean, I think this is probably a familiar story. Sometime in mid-April, I was like, I really need to make myself work on my novel. Fortunately, this time it was less, you need to take out the boring stuff and replace it with stuff that's more interesting, the editorial feedback instruction, and more, there are these connections that are implied, but it's not clear what they are. So go back and explain how these groups are connected and how stuff figures this out, and make these various characters, make their motivations make sense. The rewrites were going really pretty well until late May. So Chaos on CatNet is set in Minneapolis. It features a bus ride down Lake Street. There is also a trip to the Uncle Hugo's bookstore, although it's not named. Story also includes fictional riots. So I was literally hitting the part with the fictional riots around Memorial Day, when Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd, and large parts of my old neighborhood went up in flames. Also, Uncle Hugo's went up in flames. The irony of revising a novel with fictional riots during real unrest completely paralyzed me. And also the terrain the characters were passing through. Lake Street was the epicenter of like the fires and the unrest. It was being remapped as I was trying to write about it. So, and I had no idea what to do. My friend Lyda gave me really good advice, which was, this is set 10 years from now, more or less. I'm pretty vague about the time frame, but it's supposed to feel soon, not right now, but soon. About 10 years out is sort of how I've conceptualized it the whole way. And she said, so write the rebuilt landscape you want. Put Uncle Hugo's back, give them a beautiful new building, write the public safety force you want to exist. And that's what I ended up doing. And then I also wrote an afterword to talk about this, because there was no way I wasn't going to get specific stuff wrong. For instance, Uncle Hugo's owner, Don Bliley, is trying to reopen, but he does not want to open in Minneapolis. He wants to find a building and, ideally in one of the inner ring suburbs. So it's not going to be where I put it. Like, that's just not going to happen. But I talked about how sometimes when you're writing near future SF, you catch up with the future that you're writing. So that book came out in April. Again, it's been well received, and I'm hoping to write a third CatNet book, although it's not under contract yet. And so you remember Martha was my fourth agent, so she retired for health reasons in 2015, and I was on my fifth agent, and I just found out she's Australian, and she went back to Australia at the beginning of the pandemic, and she's going to stay in Australia, so now I'm looking for another agent. That'll be number 6. So we'll see. I also just heard from my editor, Susan Chang, that she's leaving tour, and I'm very sad about that. I'm hoping my new editor is as excellent as Susan was, because she's great. You'll sometimes hear writers, including me, complain about editors, but every single one of my books has been a way better book for the editing, way better. So what I'm working on now is a proposal and sample chapters for the next CatNet book. And something I want to have in the very first chapter is one of those activities where one day it's just randomly everywhere, like escape rooms were. So I tried to write a scene where it's a VR arcade. The problem there is that I'm not much of a gamer. I play Pokemon Go, and that's about it. My writers group critique, I have a couple of people in my writers group who are gamers, and it was pretty clear from the critique that my lack of in-person knowledge is going to be a huge problem if I try to write significant gaming stuff. So now they do this thing that's sort of like those places where you drink wine and paint pictures, except some of the paint is conductive, and when you're done, you stick a battery in the canvas and it lights up. So odds are depressingly high that by the time this book comes out, those will exist, and I won't get any credit for my originality, but that's life when you're writing near future science fiction. Sometimes things just catch up with you. So, and that's as much as I'd prepared to talk about. So, what sorts of questions do people have? I am happy to elaborate on anything or whatever.
A question about like research. You were saying you don't know a lot about gaming and you know people. Do you do a lot of, and I know it's a little bit harder with science fiction because some of the stuff you're making up. So how do you research something that doesn't exist yet? But is there any kind of research that you do for your books?
Oh, for sure. Well, and the thing about researching, I mean, researching stuff that doesn't exist yet, for near future science fiction, some of that is just like looking to see if it's like, if there are at least some people who think it's on the horizon. Because there's stuff that we just straight up like, I mean, there's stuff that's just, there's stuff that that people are actually trying to build self-driving cars. There are self-driving cars in the book. Those actually exist. They're not really usable on a road yet, but we're getting there. Some of them are usable on a road, but like they still have to have somebody sitting there trying, like to take over in an emergency. So the other thing that's really important for research in near future science fiction is to make sure you're not presenting something as new that already exists. Because sometimes that's more the problem. It's like, you assume for me with gaming, right? Because I don't know that much about gaming. It's easy for me to assume that something would be novel that is actually like really old hat to the people who have been using it. And with my writers group, the person who actually is like an enthusiastic gamer and has used stuff like the existing VR, he said that the scene was a problematic mix of stuff that's like really mundane if you've done this sort of gaming and literally impossible. Like, so, and I had been trying to write something that would be like sort of a mix of current technology and like maybe we could do this, and he was like, no, some of this is just straight up you couldn't. So at least not with anything remotely available right now. So yeah, I also like there's a whole genre of science fiction that's built around gaming, like Ready Player One, and like I mean I can't compete with Ready Player One, not on the same playing field. So, but yeah, I'm trying to think of some other examples of stuff I researched. Excuse me, and I'm drawing a blank. But yeah, like sometimes I go down the rabbit hole and like get really obsessed with getting some tiny detail right when it is something I could just make up. Like, but
Cool. And you talked about you're on looking for Agent 6, right?
yes.
So what is the process of getting an agent for, because there's a lot of writers that are expiring
Yeah.
writers that
Okay. So the process goes like this: is that first you want to make a list of agents that you think would be a good fit. And if you're starting from like previously unpublished, well, actually, okay, if you're starting from previously unpublished, step one is you write a book. If you've not been previously published, the agents want you to have finished the book. So have a fully done, polished manuscript. So then you make a list of the agents you think you want. And one of the things that makes this a little bit more complicated is that there are agents out there who are straight up fraudulent. So you want to find agents who have a client list that include people who seem to be like publishing commercially. If like an agent doesn't want to show their client list, that's a bad sign. If they're like these are my clients and everyone's self-published, that's not a good sign. Like you know, the whole point of an agent is that they can sell your book to commercial publishers. If you're going to self-publish, you don't need an agent. So one of the ways is to like look up writers who you think like I could be like, I am like this person in some way, and look to see who their agents are, and also writers you really like, and look to see who their agents are. So you know, you have a preliminary list, and then you narrow it down. You look at the agents who are like definitely people who market the stuff you write, because agents tend to specialize a bit. So like if you've written a memoir, there are agents who are all about cool memoirs, and there are agents, you know, or literary nonfiction, which memoirs usually fall into, and there are agents who are like no memoir. There are agents who, like, if you've written science fiction, there are agents who adore science fiction, and there are agents who say no science fiction. And you obviously don't want to bother wasting your time or the agent's time of querying agents who don't sell what you write. Like that's just a a fairly basic tool. There's a website called Manuscript Wish Lists, where you can look up what agents have said in the past they would love. There, a lot of agents have, there's a Twitter hashtag MSWL for Manuscript Wish List, where people will say like, gosh, you know, I could really go for a mermaid outlaw novel or whatever. And they you know, you can look up and see if anybody's like, it's going to be rare that you happen to have just finished a mermaid outlaw novel and you see somebody who's like, man, I want mermaid outlaws. But like, sometimes you'll be like, I want mermaids, or I want outlaws, or I want like fantasy YA that breaks the rules, that like, you know, goes places that like, you know, nobody else has gone. And then they'll give some example that's not mermaid outlaws, but it's like something else really weird. And you're like, this person would probably like mermaid outlaws. So those are good bets for querying. So anyway, once you've made a list, you can send more than one agent at a time. You can send lots of people a query where you're like, hi, you know, dear agent so-and-so, dear name. You introduce yourself, tell them a little bit about your work. Like if you've published short fiction, that's something worth mentioning. And then you give a pitch for your book. And there's a lot of information you can look up on how to write a pitch. It's hard to like give a summary that encompasses what makes your book cool. And again, this is genuinely hard to write. These are hard to write. And ask if you can send them. Some agents will say, just send me a partial, which means like the first 15 pages. They'll usually tell you exactly what they want. So send them whatever it is they want. Make sure you send that. And then if they like read it and they like it, they'll get back to you and they'll ask for the complete manuscript, and you send them the complete manuscript. And like there, it's sort of like sometimes they want an exclusive for a period of time. Other times they're just like, whatever, you know, it's fine if you're sending it to multiple people. This is something where, you know, it's okay to clarify expectations. You just ask them. If somebody else, they're like, if they get back to you, if 1 week after you send out your batch of queries, you hear back from somebody who's like, send me your whole manuscript, and you send it to them, and somebody else asks, you know, it's okay to just say like, it's currently on exclusive with another agency, but like, you know, I'll get it to you as soon as I can. So, you know, hopefully somebody will say like, yes, I would love to represent you. And then you talk on the phone, and there's usually a written contract, and then you have an agent. Sometimes they ghost you. It's just like sometimes you send the query and you never hear back. Sometimes you send the full manuscript and you never get back, which is why there's like you know, you don't have to wait forever. Like, you know, there's like an understanding that like they get it for, you know, they get to be the only person who has it for a week or two, not indefinitely. If you, you know, sometimes like they ask for a partial, and that's definitely not exclusive, and then they never get back to you, and it's just, it's just life. They get lots of these. It's easy to lose track. I mean, I like it. It was nice to hear back from people with a no. But sometimes it did, sometimes I didn't, sometimes I didn't. And it helps. It can help if you have a connection, but it's not necessary. There are a lot of people who do get their agents just by querying and sending the manuscripts and finding somebody who's like, oh, I love this book and I can sell it. And that's the main thing they're thinking about when they look at your manuscript is, can I sell this? And sometimes they look at a manuscript and they're like, oh, I really enjoyed this, but I have no idea who would publish it. And that means that they're not a good fit for that manuscript. And other times they're like, oh, I know exactly who would buy this. And they're, so.
Cool. Are there any authors that you got to meet while doing panels or award shows or anything that you were really excited about meeting?
Oh, yeah. Oh, for sure. Let's see. I got to sit next to George R. R. Martin at the Hugos in 2016. That was pretty cool. Let's see, where are some other good ones? Oh, this is fun. This is actually somebody I already knew, but there's an amazing writer named Helene Wecker who wrote a book called The Golem and the Genie, and she just had a new book come out called The Hidden Palace. We were college housemates. We both went to Carleton and we lived in the science fiction interest house together. So that was pretty awesome. I already knew her though. Let's see. Who are some of the other cool people I've gotten to meet? Locally, Lois Bujold, who's my favorite writer ever. I love her book so much. Back when my first novel came out, they sent it for a sell quote to Catherine Kurtz. And then I got to meet her in person. That was really cool. She blurbed my book and then I got to meet her. That was really awesome. Let's see. Some other fun ones. One in mind a second ago. Oh, this was funny. I was on a panel at Worldcon in 2016 with a guy who introduced himself and said that he had been a writer for the TV show Futurama.
Oh, cool.
And he wrote the dog episode. And I didn't even think. I just turned to him and I said, "You monster!" And it turned out he'd really liked my story, so I felt kind of bad calling him a monster. But I mean, I figure if you introduce yourself as the person who wrote the dog episode, you know it's what's coming next. Somebody's going to call you a monster. If you don't know what I mean by the dog episode, you didn't watch it. But yeah, no. One of the things I'll say one of the things that's fun about science fiction conventions is that you meet a lot of people and a lot of them are really interesting. And like a lot of the really interesting people you meet aren't even the writers, are like the readers, because science fiction fans include a lot of like interesting people who've had cool experiences and have interesting jobs. And like, I love hearing stories from, people who like work on ambulances or I mean, Scott Lynch, author Scott Lynch was for years a volunteer firefighter, and he has great stories. Yeah.
Cool. Now that you said you have 3 kids, and I'm guessing they're a little bit older now.
2 kids.
2 kids. Sorry.
3 cats.
Oh, 3 cats. Okay, maybe there was a 3 there somewhere.
Yes, it was the cats.
Cats. 3 cats, 2 kids. Did your writing schedule have to change? Like, I know they get out of the age of naps, which sort of stinks because then you don't have those like periods during the day to count on. Did you have to like sort of switch it up as to when you were doing your writing and how that worked out for you?
Yeah, well, I mean, eventually they were both old enough that they were in school all day, and you'd think that would have made it super easy to write, and instead, like, not having these structured times, and I absolutely had to be super disciplined, but that my self-discipline just kind of got steadily worse for years. I did also do some sort of like some freelance stuff as they got older, like rather than fiction. But my job before I had children was tech writing, and that's very hard to get back into once you're out for a while because your tech skills get rusty. Um, but yeah, in 2017, the schedule that I found worked for me when I was trying to write the first CatNet book was to write after midnight because the world got quiet enough that I could focus on my writing. And during the day, I was sort of being bombarded with that sense of if you turn your back for 15 minutes, something new, some new awful thing is going to happen. And that just made it incredibly hard to write. But after a certain time of night, things quieted down. So that was when I wrote, and it was summer, so my kids weren't in school. I needed to drive during the year. I needed to drive my kids to school, but I didn't need to do that anymore in the summer. And so I just got on a really late to bed, late to rise schedule and wrote really late at night. And then, of course, during the pandemic, I didn't have to drive my kid anywhere. But yeah, my ability to focus has been even worse during the pandemic. It's not that I've been completely unproductive. It's just that I try to, I try not to be too hard on myself for not being more productive because, yeah, I think it's been hard on my executive function. But yeah, like the schedule and the process and everything shifted as my kids got older because they really do get more independent. What I tell my friends with little tiny kids who are just exhausted is that the great thing about children is that eventually they get old enough where not only can they make themselves a sandwich, if you ask nicely, you can have them make you a sandwich.
Yeah.
And my kids have been at they can make you a sandwich stage for quite a while now. And they're really good kids, like both of them are. They're both just really great. They're both great kids. So
Yeah. Would you be willing to read a little bit from one of your books for us?
I'd be happy to. What would you prefer?
Whatever you would like.
Okay.
It's all good.
I could read the sex ed scene that I described writing.
Sure.
Okay. It's one of my favorite scenes to read out loud because it is so funny. So, as I explained, so this is chapter 12, and this school has a sex ed class that is taught by robot, and they hacked the robot. They put a little chip in it that put the robot on the internet. They connected it to the internet. The school had never changed the default password, so it was easy, once it was on the internet, to just hack it. So they are live streaming the AI through the robot instead of the recordings that the robot is supposed to use. The class is supervised by an EA because obviously you can't expect a robot, an automated system, to supervise students. So the way the robot taught classes are, you have all the students and you have a robot, and then you have an EA who's basically there to make sure that nobody sets the robot on fire or is using their phone in the class you're not supposed to, or whatever. So I can hardly wait for health class to start. I'm also a little worried that Rachel will give us both away, as she keeps looking at me wide-eyed and then giggling. I think Bryony's in on it too, given the looks she's shooting in my direction, but she's doing a better job of keeping a straight face. Miss Tetmeyer, the EA, is standing up at the front of the room when class starts, and for a minute, I think, dismayed, that they're going to have her teach the class instead of the robot, but she just warns us to be quiet and attentive reminds us that there will be a test, and presses the green button on the front of the robot marked Begin. Good morning, class, the robot says. I received a lot of questions from the question box, so today I will start by answering them. The synthesized voice is the same as yesterday, but I can tell already that the speech rhythms are different. It's Cheshire Cat speaking. I'd sort of expected Cheshire Cat's voice to sound a little more natural. They seem human enough in the clouder, but speaking out loud is a completely different skill set, and apparently it is not one they have mastered. The ads for instructional robots make them look like they're AIs, capable of answering whatever question you fling at them, but they aren't, not really. They have a bank full of scripted answers, and although they use a voice you can tell is synthetic, it's not like they're going to say anything that's not planned for. So most of it has been tweaked to sound as human as possible. Cheshire Cat has not been adjusted by sound engineers. The robot has been tweaked to include thoughtful pauses and even words like, Cheshire Cat isn't bothering with any of that. The intonation is okay, things like going up at the end for questions, but the pauses are too short to sound right. No human talks like this because we have to stop occasionally to think about what we're saying. Question 1, will anything bad happen to me if I masturbate? The simple answer is no, of course not. However, there's some best practices advice I would like to pass along. Ms. Tetmeyer's head snaps up in the back of the class as the robot instructs us to vary technique, lest we develop death grip syndrome, and then moves on to condom use. I'm afraid Ms. Tetmeyer is going to stop it right there, but she stays in her chair, hands folded, eyes wide. She looks like she's biting her lip. My classmates are giggling, and the robot pauses, the head turning back and forth to scan the room. Cheshire Cat is looking at me. I wonder if they recognize me. Probably not, and I can't think of a good reason to raise my hand and introduce myself. When the robot starts talking about the advantages of heavy petting over sexual intercourse, much lower risk of disease, no risk of pregnancy, a blonde girl near the front whirls around to stare at Ms. Tetmeyer. This can't be right. This can't be what it's supposed to teach us. Do something. In a cheerful, measured sort of voice, Ms. Tetmeyer says, I am not allowed to touch the robot or instruct the class in any way, and I'm not allowed to leave you unsupervised. There is literally nothing I can do other than sit here and make sure that none of you touch the robot. Call the office. Tell them what's going on. I am also not allowed to use a phone when I'm supposed to be supervising students, unless there's an emergency. This is an emergency. I don't see anyone bleeding on the floor. I'll use my phone then. Well, in theory, I'm supposed to confiscate it if you do, Ms. Tetmeyer says, but I guess I can pretend not to notice. The robot is telling us about something called pie-making parties that someone asked for a definition of, and finishes off by noting that these don't exist outside of panicked emails exchanged by bored PTA moms, and then moves on to a sexual move called the land shark that exists only in the imagination of people who have penises but have never had a sexual partner. The blonde girl gets out her cell phone and ostentatiously dials it, but no one in the office picks up. She gets up and starts looking over the robot, at which point Ms. Tetmeyer says, you aren't allowed to touch it. You are not allowed to touch it. You can't seriously expect me to just sit here and you might break it. Do you know how much the school spent on that thing? I'm only allowed to touch it to press the begin button. You're not allowed to touch it at all. Well, somebody touched it or it wouldn't be doing this. The robot's head swivels so its eyes are pointed at the blonde girl. You are being disruptive. Please take your seat like a good classroom citizen, and I will explain saddlebacking, which might be of interest to you. Is that something that the girl has looked up on the internet? From her absolutely aghast expression, I think the answer here is maybe. She plunks back down in her chair and shrieks, make it stop. Just plug your ears, Emily, Ms. Tetmeyer advises. Emily clamps her hands over her ears and hums something as the robot explains that saddlebacking is a practice intended to maintain an entirely technical sort of virginity, and then continues going through the questions. Bryony and Rachel must have either submitted an entire hour's worth themselves or put a couple of other kids up to submitting questions, because There are lots, some clearly things people wanted to know. How effective are condoms anyway? And some that were probably submitted to troll the robot. Is gerbiling real? No, Cheshire Cat says it's a homophobic urban legend. Let's see. I'm gonna skip over a little bit. Emily tries her phone again, and this time someone in the office picks up because she says the robot is not working properly and Ms. Tetmeyer won't fix it. I'm not allowed, Ms. Tetmeyer calls again from the back of the room. It explained oral sex to us, Emily shrieks, with advice on technique. I hear a door slam from somewhere down the hallway, and about 2 minutes later, the school secretary and the principal come barreling through the door. The robot swivels its head and says, for more accurate sex-positive information, visit Scarletine, and then the principal smacks a red stop button on the back. I met the principal, kind of, when she substitute taught my English class, but now her face is so red, I wonder if she's about to have some sort of medical emergency. She sweeps the whole room with an absolutely murderous glare and then fixes her eyes on me and says, new girl, what's your name? Come with me. So there's then a scene where the school investigates and are not able to pin it on Steph, in part because Steph has been coached by friends to deny, never ever admit anything to the authorities. But then TV reporters show up at the school and she has to sneak out the back with Rachel's help. So the next chapter is the AI's version of the same scene. Teaching was exhilarating. Teenagers are so much more interesting than adults. The people in the adult clatters want to talk about things like mortgages and weight loss surgery. Well, teenagers talk about much more stimulating topics. And they'd given me a lengthy spreadsheet of intriguing questions, which gave me a good place to start. The robot was equipped with a camera so I could see the class, and with the exception of Emily, the student who eventually brought the school administrators to the room, everyone seemed genuinely curious and excited. Possibly just because what I was doing was against so many rules, but I was confident all the information I was sharing was accurate and good advice. It was really a win either way. I tried to settle Emily down by offering information about a topic she tried to look up recently, but that may have been a tactical error. It seemed to just rile her up more. I was able to visually identify most of the students. Rachel and Bryony were easy. Since there were no pictures of Steph online, I used the process of elimination to determine which student was Steph. She didn't raise her hand or speak in class, but covered her mouth with one hand, and I believe her eyes were open wider than was typical. When I evaluated the potential ramifications of hacking the Robano Adept 6500 instructional robot at New Coburg High School, I felt that I was on very solid ethical ground. There are numerous studies showing the harm of giving teenagers inadequate health and sexuality information. I knew that I could provide them with comprehensive, medically accurate, sex-positive, consent-based information that would be far better than what their school wanted them to have, despite the fact that I have no sexual organs of my own, no sex drive, and no sexuality. The school's curriculum really set a low bar. I made two serious errors. First, I assumed that news of the scandal would be limited to New Coburg High School. Second, I assumed that Steph still wanted to leave New Coburg and that her mother would take her away. I guess that's actually three bad assumptions. And a fourth, that her mother would be available to take her away. Honestly, it's easy to forget just how fragile bodies are and the way every single human is at the mercy of their meat suit, not randomly deciding to go haywire. Instructional sexbot goes bananas was the first headline that caught my attention. Sexbot usually means something else, but headline writers sometimes make things sound extra salacious. You'll never believe what happened in this small town sex ed class. Sex ed robot hacked to provide accurate information, parents dismayed. Sex ed robot spews obscene information to classroom of children. There was a video clip of the robot talking, of me talking. In the clip, I'm explaining consent and how before anyone does anything, they should be making sure it's okay with the other person or people they're doing things with, and how everyone should be sober, informed, and enthusiastic. People seem to find this clip either shocking or hilarious. Apparently part of the issue is the robot voice. There was no mention of Steph's name and her picture wasn't up anywhere, so hopefully, even if people were fascinated by New Coburg for 15 minutes tomorrow, this shouldn't lead to her father showing up. As I was pondering this, Steph got online. My mom is super sick, she said to the clutter. I don't know what to do.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any authors that you used to read or still read that really inspire you to write or get ideas or such from
Yeah.
them?
So my absolute favorites as a kid were Madeline L'Engle, Robin McKinley. I loved I loved the science fiction and fantasy of the day. I loved historical novels. One of my favorite books was The Witch of Blackwood Pond. I read that one enough times that my copy fell apart. Wrinkle in Time also fell apart, which is a bummer because it's signed. I signed copy to pieces. Um, I was a big fan of Anne McCaffrey and the Narnia books. I loved the Narnia books. I was actually a big fan of any sort of portal fantasy. Oh, the Dark is Rising series by Susan Cooper. That was another one. And let's see. I was a kid that spent a lot of time in my local library. I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin has like a central library and then a lot of branch libraries. And the one nearest my house was the smallest one in the system. Still there, it's the Monroe Street branch library in Madison. And I was such a regular there. This was, of course, the days prior to cell phones. So my parents could not just call me on a cell, that not being available. So if they were trying to track me down and they didn't know where I was, they would call the Monroe Street Library and ask the librarians if they'd seen me, which worked. Like they always knew if I'd been in or if I hadn't been in. I don't recall ever getting like called over to the desk to take a phone call, but like they definitely were able to tell my parents if they'd seen me that day. I was another one of the authors that I liked and later got to meet was Jane Yolen. I read a number of Jane Yolen books growing up. The one I remember is that was sort of like the one that was really like that I reread and really liked is one of her less well-known books. It's called The Mermaid's Three Wisdoms, and it's a mermaid story. But the protagonist is a deaf girl who uses ASL, and mermaids also use a sign language, and so that's part of how they connect. These days, some of my absolute favorites. I really love. I think I've mentioned I really love Lois Bujold's work. I've read it over and over and over. I really love the Becky Chambers books. The first of which is A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. I love that it's like, it's space travel, but like most of it's about sort of the conversations between the people. I've told friends that if they liked Firefly, the TV show Firefly, but their favorite parts were just people sitting around in the galley, like blowing off steam, like they'll really love this. I really love Amal Mokhtar's work, especially her short fiction, Amal El Mokhtar. Let's see, there's some really, Jo Walton. I love Jo Walton's work. And she's a friend. She's somebody I got to meet through fandom. Jo Walton, her most recent is, what is it called? It's set in this, it's sort of a portal fantasy where the other side of the portal is like Shakespeare's version of the Italian city that Twelfth Night takes place in. It's called What You Will, I think, or What You Will is the title of the book. And it riffs on Twelfth Night. And her book before that was Lent, and it's about this like 15th century Italian monk, and like living his life over and over, Groundhog Day style. And her books are so varied and so interesting. So I've really enjoyed everything of hers that I've read. So.
Well, it looks like we've made it to 12:30, right? Is my clock right? I have no idea. I live in a world where I don't know what time it is. Yes. So we want to thank you so much for coming. This is really very interesting, and looking forward to, more of your books in the future. And hopefully if we get a chance to do that with bringing the authors from the Zoom year to Wadena so that everybody can meet them, buy their books, and get them signed, we'd love to see you.
That would be great. I'd love to come up, and thank you so much for inviting me. This was really fun.